My beloved child. Something has shifted quietly around this connection, and the person who noticed it first was not the one anyone expected. There was no dramatic confrontation, no loud confession, no moment designed to attract attention. It happened almost accidentally, through a detail that seemed too small to matter. A third party heard something your soulmate said about you, something they were never supposed to hear, and for a few seconds they did not know what to make of it. Because what they discovered was not simply another conversation about feelings. It was a promise. A private promise your soulmate had made long ago, when nobody was watching, when there was nothing to gain from saying it aloud, and when even your soulmate could not have known whether the day would ever come when they would have the courage to honor it. And this is where the story becomes different from what it may appear on the surface. Your soulmate has been carrying that promise much longer than anyone realizes. Perhaps that explains certain moments that never made complete sense to you. The hesitation. The silence. The way they seemed ready to move closer and then suddenly became thoughtful. The strange distance that never quite felt like indifference. Sometimes a person does not become quiet because they have stopped caring. Sometimes they become quiet because what they feel has grown larger than the words they know how to use. Don't skip, because the third party did not simply discover that a promise existed. They discovered what your soulmate was preparing to do because of it. And when they understood that part, their entire interpretation of your connection changed. It began on an ordinary evening. Your soulmate was going through the familiar motions of daily life, answering messages, moving through responsibilities, trying to keep their attention on practical things. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual. Then their phone lit up. A short conversation followed. Nothing emotional at first. Nothing revealing. But somewhere between an ordinary question and an ordinary answer, your name entered the conversation. Your soulmate paused. Not dramatically. Just long enough for someone nearby to notice. The third party had seen reactions before. They knew what casual looked like. This was not casual. Your soulmate looked down at the screen for a moment, almost as though they were remembering something that belonged to another chapter of their life. Then they said a sentence quietly. A sentence that was not intended to become important. I told myself that if the moment ever came, I wouldn't run from it again. The third party heard it. And suddenly there was a question in the room that nobody had asked yet. What moment? Run from what? And why did your name seem connected to it? Your soulmate tried to move on from the subject, but that single sentence had already opened a door. The third party became curious, not because they wanted to interfere, but because they realized there was history beneath the surface that they had completely misunderstood. They had assumed your soulmate was uncertain about you. They had assumed the pauses meant hesitation about the connection itself. But now another possibility appeared. What if your soulmate had never been confused about how much you mattered? What if the real struggle was whether they were ready to become the kind of person who could follow through on something they once promised themselves? Stay till the end, because the answer begins with a moment from the past that your soulmate rarely speaks about. There was a night when they had been thinking about you far more deeply than you knew. No grand setting. No crowd. No perfect words. Just your soulmate alone with their thoughts, looking at something connected to you. It may have been a photograph, an old message, a saved conversation, or simply your name resting quietly on the screen. They had reached a point where pretending everything was simple no longer worked. Something about you had touched a place in them that ordinary connections never reached. Not because everything had been easy. Perhaps because it had not been. You made them think about honesty, timing, courage. The difference between wanting someone and being prepared to show up for them properly. That evening, your soulmate made themselves a promise. They did not promise that life would unfold perfectly. They did not promise that you would automatically choose them. They did not promise some impossible future they could not control. The promise was far more grounded than that. They promised that if they ever received another genuine opportunity to speak from the heart, they would stop hiding behind uncertainty. They would tell you what had remained unsaid. They would stop expecting you to interpret silence. They would stop letting pride decide what honesty should decide. And most importantly, they promised that if they ever stepped toward you again, they would do it with intention rather than confusion. That was the secret promise. But what the third party has just discovered is that your soulmate believes the moment they were waiting for may finally be approaching. Notice what makes this meaningful. Your soulmate has not been preparing some dramatic performance. They have been making small changes nobody would recognize unless they knew what to look for. They have been rewriting a message and deleting it. Opening a conversation and closing it again. Thinking through what they actually want to say instead of reaching for whatever words feel easiest. They have been asking themselves uncomfortable but necessary questions. If I speak to this person again, am I ready to be clear? Am I ready to listen instead of merely explaining myself? Am I ready to stop making assumptions about what they feel? Am I willing to let the answer be theirs, even if it is not the answer I imagined? That final question changed something inside them. Because real sincerity is not about controlling someone else's response. It is about finally becoming honest enough to offer truth without demanding an outcome. And that is precisely why the third party was surprised. They expected to discover a secret about you. Instead, they discovered a decision your soulmate had been making about themselves. Something important is waiting for you, because this is where the third party asked the question your soulmate had been avoiding. So what are you actually going to do? Silence followed. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. They looked away, almost smiling at how simple the question sounded compared with how complicated the answer felt. Then they reached for their phone. Not to send anything. Not yet. They opened something they had saved. A draft. The third party could not see every word, but they saw enough to realize it had been written, changed, rewritten, and returned to more than once. This was not impulsive. Your soulmate had been preparing it carefully. There were no dramatic declarations inside it. No attempt to overwhelm you. The message began with something surprisingly simple. An acknowledgement. Your soulmate wanted to admit that there were things they should have communicated differently. They wanted to tell you that some of their silence had been mistaken for certainty when, in reality, it came from not knowing how to say something that mattered without risking changing everything. And then came the line that made the third party understand the promise. Your soulmate had written, "If I ever get the chance to speak honestly with you again, I want to do it without hiding behind what I should have said before." Read the emotional truth inside that. This is not someone planning to arrive with perfect answers. This is someone realizing that perfect answers were never necessary. Honesty was. And maybe a part of you has sensed that something about this connection remained unfinished, not because you were supposed to wait forever, and not because every silence carries a secret meaning, but because some conversations do leave emotional sentences incomplete. You may have wondered why certain memories returned when you thought you had already made peace with them. Why a particular phrase they once said stayed with you. Why the strongest feeling was not always sadness or longing, but curiosity. What was never said? What would have changed if both of you had been more honest at the same time? Those questions do not guarantee an outcome. But they can reveal where meaning still lives. And your soulmate has been asking similar questions. Here is the unexpected part. The third party did not encourage your soulmate to send the message immediately. Instead, they asked something wiser. Are you reaching out because you miss them, or because you are finally ready to communicate differently? Your soulmate went quiet again. That question reached deeper than the others. Missing someone is easy to recognize. Readiness is different. Readiness means understanding that affection without clarity can create confusion. Readiness means knowing that apologies matter only when accompanied by change. Readiness means approaching another person with respect for who they are now, not only for who they were in your memories. Your soulmate stared at the unfinished message for a long moment. Then something in their expression softened. Both, they finally said. But I don't want missing them to be the reason I disrupt their peace. If I speak, I want it to mean something. That sentence changed the atmosphere completely. The third party had expected emotion. They had not expected restraint. They had expected a spontaneous confession. They had not expected your soulmate to care so deeply about approaching you in a way that respected your space. And suddenly the secret promise made sense. This was never simply a promise to return. It was a promise not to return carelessly. There is a difference. A very important one. Your soulmate knows that whatever happens next cannot be built only on the intensity of what was felt before. It has to be built on what both of you are capable of creating now. That realization is why they have delayed the next move. Not because they have forgotten the promise, but because they are taking it more seriously than they once knew how to. Then something happened the third party did not expect. Your soulmate closed the message without sending it and walked across the room. For a moment, it seemed as though they had changed their mind. But instead they opened a drawer and removed something small. Something connected to you. Something they had kept. The third party did not immediately recognize it, but your soulmate did. They held it carefully, and the look on their face was not dramatic sadness. It was recognition. A quiet understanding of how far they had traveled emotionally since the day that object became meaningful. Perhaps it was a note. Perhaps a photograph. Perhaps something ordinary that would mean nothing to anyone else. Whatever it was, your soulmate looked at it and said, almost to themselves, I made that promise because I knew I couldn't keep pretending this meant nothing. That was the moment the third party finally understood the entire situation. Your soulmate had not been secretly planning some grand gesture designed to impress you. They had been preparing for a conversation that might change the shape of your connection simply because, for once, both truth and timing might finally meet. But there was still one missing piece. One reason your soulmate had not yet acted. One detail the third party discovered only moments later. And this detail is important because it explains why what happens next may look completely different from what anyone around your soulmate expects. The third party noticed that beneath the saved draft was another note. Much shorter. Only a few lines. Your soulmate tried to close it quickly, but not quickly enough. One phrase was visible. A phrase about a specific moment. A moment they had apparently chosen as the point when they would finally decide whether to send the message, request the conversation, or leave the promise quietly in the past. The third party looked at your soulmate and asked, "Is that when you're going to do it?" Your soulmate did not answer with yes. They did not answer with no. They simply said, "If what happens first goes the way I think it might, then everything changes." And that was where the real mystery began. Because whatever your soulmate is waiting for has already started moving into place, and the third party has just realized that the secret promise was only the beginning. The strange thing was, the moment your soulmate had been waiting for did not arrive with a dramatic sign. It came through something almost ordinary, the kind of detail most people would overlook without a second thought. The third party noticed it first. Your soulmate's phone lit up again, but this time they did not reach for it immediately. They simply stared at the screen from a distance, as though they already knew what might be waiting there. Something had shifted in their expression, not excitement exactly, and not nervousness either. It looked more like recognition. The kind that appears when a possibility you have quietly imagined suddenly begins to feel real. The third party watched your soulmate walk toward the phone, pick it up, and read something in complete silence. For several seconds nothing happened. Then your soulmate sat down. That small movement told the third party more than any dramatic reaction could have. Whatever they had just seen mattered. "Is that it?" the third party asked. Your soulmate did not answer. Their thumb hovered over the screen as if one careless movement could change the direction of everything they had been preparing for. And here is what makes this moment important: the message was not from you. It was not even about you directly. It was something connected to a situation your soulmate had been waiting to resolve before approaching you. Something they believed needed to become clear first, because they did not want to bring unfinished confusion into a conversation that deserved honesty. Perhaps this is one of the things you never knew about them. While you may have interpreted their distance as uncertainty about you, your soulmate had begun seeing the situation differently. They realized that reaching toward someone simply because emotions are strong is not always the same as being ready. They wanted to settle something within themselves first. They wanted to know whether they were returning because they genuinely had something different to offer, or merely because the silence had become uncomfortable. Those two motivations can look almost identical from the outside, but inside the heart they are completely different. Don't skip. Because the third party was about to hear why this particular moment mattered so much. Your soulmate finally placed the phone on the table and said quietly, "It's done." Just 2 words. The third party leaned forward. "What's done?" Your soulmate exhaled slowly, not with relief exactly, but with the feeling of someone putting down a weight they had carried longer than necessary. They explained that there had been one unresolved situation in their life. Nothing dark, nothing dangerous, simply a chapter they felt obligated to finish properly before opening another one. They had been afraid that if they spoke to you too soon, they might bring old uncertainty into something that deserved a clean beginning. So they waited. Not perfectly. Not always wisely. But they waited because the private promise they had made about you included something they had never told anyone. If they ever approached you again, they would do so without asking you to carry confusion that belonged to them. Think about the difference that makes. The promise was not, "I will make them choose me." It was not, "I know exactly what our future will be." It was, "If I ever step back into their life, I will arrive as honestly as I can." And now, for the first time, your soulmate believed they were close to being able to keep that promise. The third party looked at the saved draft again. "So now you send it?" Your soulmate almost smiled. "Not yet." That answer surprised them. After all this waiting, after all this reflection, why hesitate now? But your soulmate had learned something through the silence. Timing matters, but intention matters more. They did not want to turn a meaningful conversation into an emotional interruption. They wanted to choose their words carefully enough that you would understand there was no hidden demand inside them. No expectation that you immediately reopen a door. No attempt to make you responsible for relieving their uncertainty. They wanted to offer truth and allow you the dignity of deciding what it meant to you. That is when the third party asked a question that changed the entire direction of the evening. What exactly did you promise about them? Until that moment, your soulmate had spoken around the promise. They had explained the changes it inspired and the decisions it influenced, but they had never said the original words. The room became quiet again. Your soulmate picked up the small object they had taken from the drawer earlier and turned it slowly between their fingers. For a moment, they seemed to travel backward through memory. "I promised that if I ever understood what they actually meant to me," they said, "I wouldn't let pride speak louder than truth." The third party waited. Your soulmate continued. "And I promised that if the truth ever became clear, I would tell them, even if all I could offer was honesty." There it was. Simple. Grounded. Yet far more meaningful than the third party expected. Because your soulmate had not promised an outcome. They had promised a conversation. They had promised themselves they would stop allowing assumptions to finish sentences that honesty should have completed. Stay till the end. Because what happened next revealed that this promise had already changed your soulmate more than you realize. The third party asked them when they had first made it. Your soulmate looked down at the object in their hand, and suddenly a memory came into focus. It had happened after a conversation between the two of you, one that may have seemed ordinary at the time. Perhaps you said something sincere without realizing how deeply it landed. Perhaps you offered kindness when they expected distance. Perhaps you walked away from a difficult moment without trying to punish or control them, and that quiet dignity stayed with them. Whatever the exact detail, your soulmate went home afterward carrying your words. They replayed the conversation more than once. Not because they were trying to romanticize everything, but because something about your response forced them to see themselves more clearly. They realized that they had been waiting for certainty to arrive before becoming honest, when honesty was the very thing that might have created clarity. That night they wrote a sentence in a note on their phone: "If I get another honest chance, I will not waste it pretending I feel less than I do." The note remained there. Weeks passed. Life moved forward. New responsibilities appeared. Conversations changed. Your soulmate tried to place the feeling somewhere manageable. Yet every time they came across that note, they remembered the promise. Sometimes they almost deleted it. Once, they even pressed and held the screen as though they were about to erase the entire thing. But they stopped. Not because they wanted to stay trapped in the past. Because the promise had become less about you alone and more about the person they wanted to become. Someone capable of speaking clearly. Someone capable of admitting when a connection mattered. Someone who would no longer hide behind timing, pride, or endless analysis. The third party listened with a seriousness that had not been there at the beginning. They had entered the conversation expecting to uncover some romantic secret. Instead, they were watching your soulmate confront a version of themselves they had been slowly outgrowing. And then came an unexpected question. What if they've changed? The third party asked. Your soulmate answered almost immediately. They probably have. There was no disappointment in their voice. No resistance. So have I. That response mattered. Your soulmate was not preparing to approach an old version of you preserved inside memory. They understood that time changes people. Experiences deepen them. Boundaries shift. Priorities become clearer. The person they remember may not be exactly the person you are now, and they know that. In fact, this realization had become part of the promise too. If they spoke to you, they wanted to meet you where you actually are, not where nostalgia had left you. Something important is waiting for you, because at that exact moment, your soulmate changed the message. They opened the draft, read the first few lines, and deleted an entire paragraph. The third party looked surprised. I thought you worked on that for weeks. I did, your soulmate said. That's why I know this part doesn't belong anymore. The deleted paragraph had been an explanation. A long attempt to justify past hesitation. Your soulmate suddenly realized that explaining everything could easily become a way of asking you to excuse everything. They did not want that. They replaced the paragraph with something shorter. There are things I understand differently now, and I don't expect you to carry the weight of what I took too long to understand. The third party read the line and nodded. Something about it felt different. Less like a speech. More like accountability. Your soulmate continued editing. They removed anything that sounded as though they were predicting your response. They removed sentences that assumed you still felt the same way. They removed language that placed pressure on the future. What remained was quieter and stronger. A message that essentially said, I have something honest to tell you. I respect where you are now. I am not reaching out to disturb your peace. But I once promised myself that if I ever became clear about what this connection meant to me, I would not hide that truth forever. That was the message your soulmate wanted you to receive. Not a demand. Not a declaration that your future had already been decided. An opening. A chance for two people to speak without the old noise surrounding them. But then your soulmate did something even the third party did not anticipate. They still did not press send. Instead, they stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, life continued normally. Cars moved. Lights changed. People somewhere were laughing, eating, talking, living through evenings that had nothing to do with this private decision. Your soulmate looked out for a while and said, I need to know I'm okay if they don't answer the way I hope. The third party understood immediately. This was the final test of the promise. Was your soulmate ready to tell the truth because truth deserved to be spoken, or were they secretly using honesty as a strategy to obtain a particular response? Those are not the same thing. Your soulmate needed to separate them. They needed to reach a place where their sincerity did not depend on controlling what came afterward. And slowly, that understanding settled inside them. They could care deeply about you and still respect your freedom. They could hope and still remain grounded. They could say what needed to be said without turning that honesty into a burden for you to solve. Perhaps this is why their next move may surprise the third party more than the promise itself. Because the third party expected your soulmate to rush once the obstacle disappeared. Instead, your soulmate became calmer, more deliberate, almost peaceful. The urgency that had followed them for weeks began fading, not because the feeling became weaker, but because clarity replaced panic. And clarity changes the way a person moves. They no longer felt they had to create the perfect moment. They simply needed to recognize a respectful one. Then the third party noticed something on the table. Another piece of paper had fallen partly beneath the small object your soulmate had been holding. It was folded once through the middle. Your soulmate reached for it, but the third party had already seen a few handwritten words near the edge. This was not another draft message. It looked older. The handwriting was less controlled, as though it had been written quickly during an emotional moment. "Is that the original promise?" the third party asked. Your soulmate froze for half a second. Then they laughed softly, almost embarrassed that something so personal had finally been discovered. Part of it. They unfolded the paper. There were several sentences. They did not hand it over, but they read one line aloud. "When I know I'm ready, I will choose courage over guessing." The third party smiled. "And are you ready?" Your soulmate looked toward the phone. Then toward the old note. Then back at the third party. "Closer than I've ever been." But one word stood out. Closer. Not ready. Not yet. There was still something they wanted to do first. And this was where the next part of the secret emerged. Your soulmate had decided they would not begin by sending the carefully polished message. After weeks of writing and rewriting it, they suddenly understood that the first move needed to be simpler. More human. Less rehearsed. The third party watched as your soulmate opened your contact, stared at the screen, then backed out again. "What are you doing?" they asked. Your soulmate answered with a sentence that changed everything the third party thought was about to happen. "I'm not going to tell them everything in a message." The third party raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you going to do?" Your soulmate looked at the draft one final time. "I'm going to ask if they're open to a real conversation." That was it. No dramatic speech delivered without warning. No emotional wall of text arriving at the wrong time. Just a respectful question. An invitation to speak, with room for you to accept, decline, or take your time. And somehow that simple choice made the promise feel more serious than anything else could have. Because your soulmate was finally understanding that courage is not measured by how much you say. Sometimes courage is asking one clear question and being willing to receive an honest answer. Yet something prevented them from typing even that question immediately. The third party noticed your soulmate glancing at the clock. There was a specific reason they were waiting until later. A reason connected to something you once told them. A small detail about when you preferred serious conversations, something they had remembered even though you might have forgotten saying it. That detail stunned the third party. Your soulmate had remembered not merely your words, but the conditions under which you felt most comfortable being heard. You remembered that? They asked. Your soulmate gave a quiet nod. Some things stay with you. And there, beneath all the suspense, was perhaps the rarest realization of all. What mattered most was not the dramatic promise your soulmate had made. It was the way that promise had taught them to pay attention. To your boundaries. Your peace. Your right to be approached with care. Your right to decide what comes next. The third party had found out expecting to gain leverage over a secret. Instead, they found themselves becoming unexpectedly protective of the sincerity behind it. Then don't ruin it by overthinking, they told your soulmate. When the right moment comes, just be real. Your soulmate smiled because those words echoed almost perfectly what they had written to themselves long ago. Just be real. The room became quiet again, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt like the space between preparation and action. Your soulmate placed the old handwritten promise beside the phone. They opened your contact once more. This time they did not close it. Their thumb moved toward the screen. One short sentence began appearing. Then another. The third party looked away, understanding that whatever happened from here belonged first to the two people at the center of the story. But just as your soulmate prepared to finish the message, something happened that neither of them had planned for. A notification appeared at the top of the screen. Your soulmate stopped typing immediately. The third party saw their expression change, not with alarm, but with complete disbelief. Because the notification was connected to you in a way that made the timing almost impossible to ignore. Your soulmate stared at it, then at the unfinished message they had just begun writing. The third party whispered, "You have got to be kidding." Your soulmate said nothing. For the first time all evening, the person who had spent weeks preparing words seemed to have none. And what appeared on that screen did not answer the question of whether they should contact you. It created an entirely new question, one that would force your soulmate to decide whether the secret promise was truly ready to become action. For one suspended second, even the room seemed to lose its ordinary rhythm. Your soulmate was still holding the phone, the unfinished sentence resting beneath the notification, and the third party could tell immediately that whatever had appeared on that screen had reached somewhere deeper than simple surprise. It was connected to you, but not in the way either of them expected. There was no sudden confession from you. No dramatic message arriving at the perfect cinematic moment. It was something much smaller, much more believable, and somehow that made it more powerful. Your name had surfaced through a shared connection, attached to something recent, something that quietly confirmed you had moved forward with your life in ways your soulmate had not fully understood. Perhaps it was a photograph, a mention, a small update, or a conversation in which someone casually spoke about how much you had changed. Nothing was directed toward your soulmate. That was exactly why it affected them. For weeks, they had been preparing to speak to the version of you they remembered. Now, in a few seconds, they were reminded that you had continued becoming someone new while they were deciding what courage meant. The third party leaned slightly closer. What is it? Your soulmate read the notification again. Then they lowered the phone. They're doing well. There was something unexpectedly warm in the way they said it. No disappointment. No resentment. Just a quiet realization. And this is where the promise took another shape. Your soulmate had spent so long wondering whether they still had a place in your heart that they had almost forgotten to ask a more important question. If you had finally found peace, would they be willing to protect it even if that meant approaching you more carefully than they originally planned? Don't skip, because the next decision revealed more about their feelings than any dramatic declaration could have. Your soulmate deleted the sentence they had been typing. The third party immediately noticed. Why did you erase it? Your soulmate did not look upset. In fact, they seemed clearer than before. Because I was about to make the conversation about what I need to say. They paused, then looked again at the notification. Maybe it should begin with where they are, not where I've been. That distinction changed everything. The original draft was honest, but it still centered your soulmate's emotional journey. Their regrets. Their realization. Their promise. Their need to finally communicate. Now they understood that if they truly cared about you, then the first question could not be, how do I finally tell them everything? It needed to be, how do I approach them without assuming they have been waiting for this? The third party sat back, almost impressed by the shift. Earlier, they had discovered someone who had made a secret promise about you. Now they were watching that promise mature in real time. It was becoming less about fulfilling an emotional vow and more about becoming someone capable of honoring another person's reality. Your soulmate opened a blank message again. This time they typed only a few words. They read them silently. Deleted two. Added another. The third party laughed softly. You said you weren't going to overthink it. Your soulmate smiled. I'm trying not to. Then they showed the screen. The message was simple, I hope you've been well. There's something I've wanted to speak honestly about, but only if you'd be comfortable having that conversation sometime. Nothing more. No emotional avalanche. No hidden pressure. No assumption that you owed them access to your time. The third party read it twice. That's all? Your soulmate nodded. That's enough for the first step. And there was wisdom inside that answer. Sometimes people believe important feelings require enormous speeches. But the deepest respect can appear in restraint. In leaving room for another person to breathe. In recognizing that sincerity becomes more meaningful when it does not demand immediate reciprocation. Your soulmate had finally arrived at the edge of the promise, yet instead of becoming more intense, they were becoming gentler. Stay till the end. Because the third party was about to discover there was another reason your soulmate had waited all this time. They had assumed fear was the main obstacle. It was not. Your soulmate had once come very close to speaking to you before. Much earlier. Long before the draft message, long before tonight, long before anyone else knew about the promise. There had been a moment when they almost told you everything. The opportunity had appeared naturally. You were talking. The atmosphere was calm. Your soulmate could feel the words waiting behind their hesitation. They nearly said them. Then you mentioned something that stopped them, not because it discouraged them, but because it made them realize you were carrying more than they knew. Perhaps you spoke about needing space. Perhaps you said you were focusing on rebuilding a part of your life. Perhaps you admitted you were tired of uncertainty and wanted simplicity for a while. Your soulmate listened. And although part of them wanted to finally confess what they felt, another part understood that choosing that particular moment might have been more about relieving their own emotional pressure than respecting yours. So they stayed quiet. For a long time afterward, they questioned that decision. Had they been cowardly? Had they missed their chance? Had silence once again won? But slowly they recognized something: not every silence is avoidance. Sometimes silence is listening. Sometimes love, care, or deep affection becomes visible not through the words someone insists on saying, but through the words they choose to hold until there is space for them to be received. That memory had become part of the secret promise too. Your soulmate had promised themselves they would speak honestly, yes, but never at the cost of ignoring what you might need. The third party had never known this. So you could have told them back then? They asked. Your soulmate nodded. I almost did. Why didn't you? Your soulmate looked toward the phone again. Because they were telling me what they needed, even if they didn't know I was listening that closely. The third party became quiet. That answer rearranged their understanding of the entire story. They had once assumed your soulmate's silence meant they were undecided. Now they realized some of it had come from respect. Not perfect respect. Not flawless timing. Your soulmate still knew there were things they should have handled differently. But the silence was more complicated than indifference. And perhaps yours was too. Maybe there were moments when you wanted to say more but did not know whether the other person could truly hear it. Maybe there were times when you chose dignity over chasing an answer. Maybe you stopped explaining yourself because you became tired of trying to make someone understand what they were not yet ready to understand. If so, your soulmate has started recognizing that now. Not in a dramatic burst of regret, but through a quieter realization. Some of the things they once interpreted as distance may actually have been your way of protecting your peace. Something important is waiting for you, because the third party then asked the question your soulmate had never fully allowed themselves to answer. What if they say no? Your soulmate looked at the message on the screen. The question no longer frightened them the way it once might have. Then I respect it. And the promise? I still keep it. The third party looked confused. Your soulmate explained. The promise wasn't that they would choose me. The promise was that I would stop hiding from the truth and handle it with respect. That was the moment everything became simpler. Your soulmate finally understood that keeping the promise did not require a particular ending. It required integrity. If you were open to the conversation, they would speak. If you were not, they would accept that boundary without turning it into another unfinished battle. And strangely, that acceptance gave them more courage than hope alone ever had. Because hope can make a person desperate when it is tied to control. But hope combined with acceptance becomes steady. It allows someone to move honestly without trying to force life into a specific shape. The third party looked again at the message. Then send it. Your soulmate's thumb hovered over the screen. But once more, they waited. Not because they had changed their mind. This time they were thinking about you. About the possibility that your day was already full. About whether the timing respected what they remembered about your rhythms. About whether sending the message late at night would make it feel heavier than intended. And there was something almost touching about how carefully they were considering these small details. This was the same person who had once believed that feelings themselves were enough. Now they understood that how you carry feelings matters just as much as having them. They set the phone down. Tomorrow. The third party raised an eyebrow. After all this? Your soulmate laughed quietly. After all this, one more night won't change what's true. That sentence showed how different they had become. Earlier versions of them might have treated urgency as proof of love. Now they saw patience differently. If something was sincere, it did not need to become impulsive to prove its importance. And what happened during that final night of waiting became almost as meaningful as the message itself. Your soulmate did not spend hours imagining your response. They did not create elaborate futures in their mind. They did not rehearse arguments or explanations. Instead, they went back through the old promise one last time and asked themselves whether each part still felt true. I will choose courage over guessing. Yes. I will speak clearly if I have the chance. Yes. I will not let pride decide what honesty should decide. Yes. But then they noticed something they had forgotten. At the bottom of the old paper, beneath the lines the third party had already seen, there was one final sentence. It had been folded beneath the crease. Your soulmate stared at it longer than the rest. The handwriting was faint, but the words were clear. And if they have found peace without me, I will care enough not to turn my feelings into a disruption. Your soulmate had written that line on the same night as the original promise. They had forgotten it was there. The third party saw their expression change as they read it. You wrote that? Your soulmate nodded slowly. Apparently I understood more than I thought. The sentence did not make them abandon the idea of reaching out. Instead, it gave them a clearer standard. The message had to offer peace, not steal it. It had to open a door, not push through one. That was why the wording mattered. That was why the timing mattered. That was why asking permission for the deeper conversation mattered. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No extraordinary sign. No dramatic coincidence. Just light through a window, the quiet beginning of another day, and your soulmate waking with the strange calm that sometimes appears after a decision has already been made internally. They did not reach for the phone immediately. They made coffee. They moved through a few ordinary tasks. They gave themselves time to see whether the courage from the night before survived daylight. It did. In fact, it felt more grounded now. The third party eventually messaged them, still doing it? Your soulmate looked at the question and smiled. Yes. Then they opened your contact. The message from last night was still there, unsent. They read it once. No edits. No rewriting. That mattered. For the first time, they were not trying to make the words perfect. They trusted the intention behind them. Their thumb moved toward send. And this time, there was no interruption. The message left the screen. No music. No dramatic reaction. Just a tiny shift from draft to delivered. Your soulmate placed the phone face down. The third party, who had been waiting for confirmation, received a single message, done. But what surprised them most was what your soulmate did next. They did not stare at the screen. They did not refresh the conversation. They did not begin counting minutes. They returned to their day. This may sound small, but it represented the final transformation of the promise. Your soulmate had done what they could control. They had spoken respectfully. Now they were allowing you to control what belonged to you, the response. Time passed. A few minutes. Then longer. Your soulmate noticed the phone more than once but resisted turning uncertainty into a story. They reminded themselves that you could be busy. You could be thinking. You could need time. Or you could decide not to engage. Every possibility belonged to you. And somehow accepting that made their feelings feel cleaner. The third party checked in again. Anything? Not yet. Are you okay? Your soulmate thought about it. Actually, yes. That answer surprised even them. Because they had spent so long imagining that sending the message would create unbearable uncertainty. Instead, it created relief. They had finally stopped asking silence to carry words that silence was never meant to hold. Hours later, the phone lit up. Your soulmate saw your name. Everything inside them became still. They did not open the message instantly. Not because they were playing a game, but because they wanted to read it when they could receive whatever you had chosen to say without projecting their hopes onto it. They sat down. Took a slow breath. Then opened your response. The third party would not learn the exact words immediately. Your soulmate kept that part private. But they did learn one thing from the expression that appeared on your soulmate's face. You had not closed the door. You had not thrown it wide open either. Your response was measured. Thoughtful. Perhaps even a little unexpected. You acknowledged the message. You made it clear you had changed. You hinted that there were things you had wondered about too. But you also made one boundary very clear: if there was going to be a conversation, it needed to be honest from the beginning. No disappearing behind vague language. No returning to old patterns. No making each other guess. Your soulmate read that part several times. Then something almost remarkable happened. They smiled. Not because everything had suddenly worked out, but because your words mirrored the very promise they had been carrying. Honesty. Clarity. No guessing. The third party called later and asked what happened. Your soulmate gave only the simplest answer. They're willing to talk. Silence came from the other end. Then, so this is it? Your soulmate looked at the old handwritten promise resting nearby. No, they said softly. This is where it actually begins. And that distinction mattered more than anything. Sending the message was not the great ending your soulmate once imagined. It was the first step into something much more difficult and meaningful, a real conversation where neither of you could hide behind assumptions anymore. A conversation where your soulmate would have to explain why they waited. Where you might finally say what their silence felt like from your side. Where both of you would discover whether the connection you remembered could exist between the people you had become. The third party thought the secret promise had already changed everything. They were about to learn that the promise was only preparing your soulmate for what came next. Because when the time for the conversation was finally chosen, your soulmate opened the old note again and added one new line beneath everything they had written long ago. Not a promise about winning you back. Not a prediction about where this would lead. Just 6 quiet words that showed exactly how much had changed. This time, I will truly listen. And your soulmate did not yet know that during the coming conversation, you were going to reveal something they had never considered, something about the past that would make them understand why your connection had remained unfinished in both of your minds for entirely different reasons.